All right, welcome everyone to another edition of Code. I'm your host, Dan Vega. You can find me on Twitter at @TheRealDanVega. You can find me everywhere else over at danvega.dev and learn more about me. But I'm a Spring developer advocate on the Tanzu team, and we're just going to kind of give it a few minutes here. I want to give a little bit of a chance for people to get in. I want to make sure my audio is working. So if you're out there and you hear me, please let me know. Had some audio issues yesterday and everyone wasn't hearing me, but I think we should be okay today. Also, I'm just kind of getting set up here. We are going to do a lot today, and I'll get into that in a minute. So again, we're just getting started. If you are in the audience, if you're out there, I see a few of you at least, please go ahead and let me know if I sound okay. Dealing with some audio issues the last couple of days and just want to make sure we're okay. And it looks like our Twitch went out with the wrong description, so that's always fun. Not sure I can change that now, so not much I can do about it now. Hey, someone's in the audience. Here we go. Hey, Sameh. I hope I said that right. Can you let me know if you can hear me okay? Just trying to make sure we're okay before we get started. Oh, we still have a bunch of people rolling in, so this is good. Okay, I'm just going to keep talking. Hopefully we're okay, and I'll let you know what we're going to do today. So actually, let me go ahead and share my screen. And I just want to talk through some of the things that we're going to do today. So this is a code episode. We are going to build things with Spring. We're going to build some fun things with Spring. And I'll get to that in a second. I just kind of want to walk through some things that I'm up to right now. So again, if you don't know, my website is danvega.dev. You can also find a bunch of info on me over at the Tanzu Developer Advocates. So again, I am not getting paid specifically to tell you about this. This is Tanzu's Developer Center, something I didn't know a lot about before I got here. Whole bunch of really great free content. One of the things you can find on here is the advocates. So we are the team of advocates, and if you go ahead and click on me here, you can get some more information about me and some of the presentations I've done. Also, we are working on a Spring One tour. So we've already visited Chicago. I unfortunately didn't get to go there. I ended up having COVID from vacation right before Chicago started, which was a huge bummer, and I didn't get to go. And I got to be honest, I was really, really sad because it was the first time I was going to get to meet some of my coworkers in person. And I just wanted to see people in general and talk about Spring in person and not behind a keyboard and a screen. So I was really looking forward to that. But I will be in Toronto. So if you're in Toronto, June 7th through the 8th, come check us out. It's going to be an awesome, we have a whole bunch planned. Cora and I are doing a talk on test containers at a meetup early on Monday afternoon on the 6th. So again, if you're around there, come check us out for that. And then the 7th and the 8th, there's a whole bunch of content scheduled. I know that one of the talks that I'm doing, actually this is the only talk I'm doing here, which is getting started with Spring for GraphQL. So I'm excited about this talk. If you're in Toronto, come check it out. So that's the Tanzu Developer Center. Again, if you want to learn about me, I'm over here. I've made some updates to my website lately. First and foremost, I added a new blog post, the Spring Boot @value annotation. Nothing new. We've probably all used it before. But I got back to writing blog posts. And with that, sitting outside. It's getting warm around here, and I was able to just sit outside and write this blog post in about an hour. And it was great to just get back to kind of writing and blogging, because a lot of the writing I've been doing lately is for newsletters, which is fine. I like writing for my newsletter, but I haven't been blogging a lot. So I'm gonna try and get back to that. With that, I noticed like a bunch of issues with my code, like my code fences. So especially the inline ones were creating block ones. I tweeted this out earlier. I fixed that, and I actually did a whole bunch of stuff on the website today. So now I have a published on date, and I'm going to go through and actually like update posts that I think need updating. So one of the ones was the command line runner. So if this gets updated, you will see an updated on. So updated on May 11th. This was updated today. I just went through and kind of updated this. Some of these blog posts are 5-6 years old and using an older version of Spring Boot. And so I wanted to update that and kind of like bring them up to a kind of modern Spring Boot and Java 17, and just, I feel like I'm a much better writer now, 5 years later. So just went through there and kind of cleaned a lot of things up. So I'm going to be doing this for a lot of the top posts that I have, and then posts that kind of reference. I want to make sure I reference posts from posts. So hopefully you'll see a lot more on a blog coming, and a lot more cleaner articles. So the reason that I bring that up is because that is kind of what we are here to do today. We are going to create some fun projects, demos in Spring. I basically have something I want to work on for next week, and that is, I've been asked to kind of come up with a demo for pagination in Spring, more specifically in GraphQL. But before we can get to the GraphQL bits, we need to talk about pagination in Spring, right? So I think what we're going to do is we're going to end up building two pieces of content out of this. One thing I'm really trying to get better at is I write and I talk, as you can see now, kind of rambling and aimlessly and without purpose. And I just have so many blog posts and so much content in all of the newsletters I write that I really want to be more specific with them, so we can repurpose these. Like if I have a blog post that I haven't done a video on, we need to get that out there. And just the idea of taking like a simple idea into a demo, into a blog post, into a video, into a course, right? Just trying to get all of this information out there and keep it up to date so that you guys you guys can learn from those. So I want to create, we're really going to create two pieces of content today. One is we want to talk about paging in Spring Data. So we're going to create a simple application with an H2 database and a Spring Data JPA. And we'll take a look at the paging and sorting interface that we can go ahead and extend from. So we'll create a repository that extends from that. And we'll take a look at that. And then, one of the questions I got was, hey, how can I do paging in GraphQL? And so what I want to take from that is that GraphQL does not care about your data. GraphQL is independent of the data layer. So once we have the data layer in place, that is what we're going to use. And then we'll kind of set up GraphQL to go ahead and talk to that repository, and then take the bits that we need to return back to the GraphQL API, so that the consumer of the API knows, hey, this is page 0, and you're going to get 5 records back. So then you can go ahead and create your paging, your filtering, your sorting, all that stuff on the client side. So we'll ease into that today. We'll get started in a second. So what I usually start with too, what I've been doing more of lately, I like, so when I write, I have to be like distraction free. If I write in the browser or there's tabs up, like there's too many tabs open in a browser, it always distracts me and takes me down. Like I get, is Twitter open? Is Gmail open? I get another notification that I got an email, and like those things kind of distract me. I'm a huge fan of Notion. If you know anything about me, I've done a lot with Notion. The Notion client for the desktop is really great because it kind of gives me this distraction free zone. So this is that blog post that I just showed you. I start here in Notion, I create it, and then I can go ahead and export out Markdown from here and put it into my website, which is just a Vue static site, statically generated, all from Markdown. So I've talked a lot about that in the past. We won't get to that today, but this is how I like to write. So I'm going to go into blog posts. I don't have a lot here because, again, I haven't blogged a lot this year, but that's going to change. So I just want to take some notes and talk about what we're going to build today. So again, we're going to create two different kind of pieces of content here. So Spring Data, JPA paging, right? And then paging in GraphQL. We're going to do all this today, but I just want to keep these here so that I can reference them. I'll probably keep it off page, but I just want to take notes so that, like, as we're going along, if I want to make sure that I want to make sure that we're writing about something, then I'm going to keep notes on it. So let's get back to this and this. All right, so Spring Data and paging. So we'll kind of ease into the paging part. We'll start with the Spring Data, the JPA part. Please go ahead and ask your questions as we go. I'm going to be coding for a while. You know what? I put my headphones on for this specific reason. I need to find a way to pipe in some music into StreamYard. We're going to be coding for a while today, and I'm kind of here by myself. So I don't think, we are DRM free because we are not, I don't think we're turned on monetization. So I don't think it matters, but I'm going to go ahead and play some music for me. And anyways, I don't think you guys would like my music that much. I mean, I guess I'm pretty like pop, rap. Actually, when it comes to music, I live by the ABC rule, anything but country. So I'm listening to music right now just so I can get through the next couple hours. It's how I write code, it's how I think. So let me know if you guys hear that. I want to make sure that you're not hearing that. Cool. Let's get going. Please ask your questions as we go. I'd like to, I have no problem stopping and seeing if we can address those. All right. So what are we building here today? We are building a project called GraphQL paging. And let me bump this up and make sure you guys can see this. So we're creating something called GraphQL paging. We are going to choose Maven. We are going to choose Java. This is important. Let's actually go over here. So calendar.spring.io. If you aren't watching Office Hours, not The Office, Office Hours, Tanzu TV, Spring Office Hours. This is a new show where Deshaun and I basically take a look at what's new in the Spring world. We do some demos. We answer your questions. Office Hours, great place to visit. So go ahead and check out that. And we should have a new show coming up next week. Anyways, one of the things we do is kind of look at this calendar and say what's coming new. And if you notice, next week, we have a couple of things that are pretty important. Spring for GraphQL 1.0 is going to hit GA. I'm so excited about that. I have been, building out demos and playing with GraphQL, for the last few months. And there's so many cool things you could do with it. And it's so well put together, as every project in the Spring world is. It's well documented. It sits on top of an established project in GraphQL Java. So I'm really excited for that coming next week. in line with that, Spring 2.7.0 is coming next week. And that is an important bit because you have to select 2.7 or further for Spring GraphQL. So let me show you what I mean by that. So if you use the latest stable right now, which is 2.6.7, and you come up here and you try to select Spring GraphQL, it's going to say, hey, you can't do that. You need 2.7 or later and less than 3.0. So we are going to select 2.7.0 RC1. Let's go ahead and say Vega. We are going to choose jar, and I'm going to choose Java 17. So again, if you're new to Spring, the Spring initializer at start.spring.io, this is just a way to bootstrap an application. It generates your starting code. It doesn't generate code in general. Like, it's not going to generate code going forward. This is just a way to say, this is the type of application I'm about to build, and this is what it's going to look like to start with. This is not how it will end. Just because you select certain things here in the starter doesn't mean that you are stuck with them. You can always change these things in the application as you go. Sorry for the coffee too. I have 2 young kids. I don't sleep a lot, so this is number 3 for today. Okay. So now we need some dependencies. Dependencies, I always kind of, I think of like, hey, if I was gonna make dinner tonight for a dinner party, I know what I'm gonna make. Now I need to figure out what the ingredients are that is going to help me make that thing, right? So whatever I'm making for dinner tonight, what are the ingredients I need? I'm gonna write down those on a list, go through the grocery store and pick those out, right? That's kind of what we're doing here. We kind of know what we're gonna make. We're gonna make a web application. It's going to have Spring Data JPA in it, which is going to talk to an H2 database. We're going to have GraphQL support. It's going to have testing support. We know what these things are. We know what we're going to make. So let's go ahead and pick out our ingredients. So we know that we're going to make a web application. We're going to use Spring MVC. You can use reactive web if you want. We know we need Spring Data JPA. We're going to use that. We know we need a database, so we're going to use H2. If you were Java 16, you can always come in here and use Lombok. Actually, you could probably still use Lombok because we are using Spring Data JPA today, and you cannot use records with JPA just because of the way records are immutable. JPA doesn't like that, so we can't use records today, so you could use that if you wanted to. So I got JPA web. I'm also going to select GraphQL. I think that's really all we need. So now what we're going to do, we're going to go ahead and generate this. So you can go ahead and generate. I'm going to go ahead and open this up in Explorer or in Finder. I don't know why I said Explorer. I haven't used Windows in 10 years. And then I'm going to drag the POM right here into IntelliJ. And it's going to open it. GitHub Copilot. I will update you later. All right, again, any questions out there, please let me know. This is a previous... I don't know why that did. That was I just told you that command line runner, I just updated on my website, and so I updated some code. So it's weird that it opened that. Did I grab the wrong one? There we go. Downloads GraphQL paging. All right. If I start dancing, it's because I'm listening to music and you are not, so I apologize. No, I will not tell you what I'm listening to right now. Okay, so if you know me, I love to just go ahead and run this. I do so much on 80/80 and 80. I just want to make sure nothing's in conflict, which it isn't, so we are good there. So we need to start building out an application. So I'm going to build out just a simple CRM. This is going to take care of some users, and we're going to eventually use a cool library to go ahead and populate a bunch of users. Because when it comes to paging, we're really worried about, after we build our demo and we're done with those like 5 records that we just inserted, we don't always want to list them all. If there's 1,000 records in there, on a client page, we may only want to list 20 at a time and page through those. So we'll use this cool library called Java Faker later on to go ahead and populate some data. But for now, let's just start to build this out. And the way that I usually start with this is the model. So I'm going to create a new package. We're going to call it model. I'm going to create a new Java class, and we're going to call this person. So we are building out entities. So normally, if this was like Spring Data JDBC, or we were just using, say, JDBC template, you would just kind of build out plain old Java objects. In this case, we're going to build out entities. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this with @entity, and it's going to complain because we probably need an ID. Yep, so we need a primary key. So now what we're doing is we're creating a model and that kind of maps to the database. And so I might have a private integer ID, and I'm going to go ahead and say that this is our ID, and I want it to be a generated value. I don't want to have to insert a new ID each time. So private string first name, private string last name, private string phone number, private string email. So again, these are just people. Again, in my CRM, it could be your list of friends. It could be things at work. I'm also going to have an address. So I'll have a private address. So now, first off, we need to create this. Oh, I don't know why it's not good. So let's create an address. And again, this is going to be an entity. We are going to use an ID. No, I don't want an ID. And then getters and setters for everything. And a toString. Oh, I love Java records. It's the only place I really can't use them. So been working a lot lately on demos with different things like add configuration properties, so you can use a record for that. You can use records for normal POJOs that you would usually have, but the only time you can't use them is when we're here in JPA. And the reason for that is JPA needs this public constructor that has no arguments, and you can't do that in a record because a record is immutable. So a record, you need to construct your object right when it's instantiated. After that, you can no longer change anything. You can always access that data, but you can't change it. So that's why we're going long form here. No biggie. People look at this code. I get it. It's verbose, but a couple of buttons in the IDE and I've generated everything. So. Okay, so we have our address. Now we have our person. Let's go ahead and it's complaining first. Oh, that's why. I don't know what the heck it was importing that for. All right, well, it's going to complain about this. It's going to say, hey, I need you to map this somehow, right? Like we need to, once you get your models set up, so you have all your different models, if one is referencing another, we need to start to define how those relationships are. So the first thing I'm going to do is say that this is a one-to-one. What that's saying is, let's take reader mode off. Specifies a single value association to another entity that has one-to-one multiplicity. I don't want to go through all this. I'll just kind of talk to it. So again, my one person has one address. That one address has one person. So this is a one-to-one mapping. This is kind of understanding JPA and really understanding how to build these entities and set up these relationships are probably the toughest part. Well, I take that back. The toughest part is figuring out what went wrong when it went wrong. Debugging Hibernate and JPA is where you really make your money. So anyway, so we have a one-to-one. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say cascade is cascade type all. And so all we're saying there is cascade all of the operations. So if I create a person with an address, I want you to cascade that down. I expect an address to get persisted. We can go ahead and customize this a little bit further with this join column annotation. And what I'm going to do is say I want that column to be address underscore ID. And I want to reference the column name ID. Oh, I'm sorry, ID on the other side. So that is really it from this point of view from the model, right? So we have the model set up. Let me put that up. Also, if you're out there, you know, I got a comment the other day. I'd love to hear your feedback on this. I usually write code in dark mode in IntelliJ, in Visual Studio Code, whatever I'm using. But a long time ago, I started presenting in light mode because it just comes off better, especially in in-person presentations. I don't know if that's the same case online. As a viewer, I'm fine with dark mode. I'm fine with watching other people use dark mode. But I got a comment saying that dark mode is so much better for presentations, and I don't know that to be true. I think light mode here in IntelliJ looks great. I think it's better if that's your preference, but I'd just be curious to know what you guys think. So let me know. Okay, so we have our two models. We need a way to persist some data. We want to save some new people into our H2 database, which we haven't set up yet. We need to configure some things to make that work, but let's just talk about the repositories. So Let's create a new package. I'm going to call this repository. We're going to call this a person repository, and it's going to be an interface. So here in Spring Data, not just Spring Data JPA, dark mode equals I'm squinting. Yeah, I can again. I think for presentations, light mode is better for the viewer. And then if you're writing code, whatever mode you like to write in, that's your thing. You know, I always tell people whether it comes to dark mode or light mode or IntelliJ or VS Code or Eclipse, like whatever makes you productive, do that. Don't feel like you need to have the same setup as some YouTuber or some person that you're watching. You know, do whatever makes you productive. So I agree. I'm going to stick with light mode for presentations. I think it looks good and clean. So, okay. So we've created a public interface person repository. Right now, this is doing nothing. But what we are going to do is we are going to extend one of the Spring Data repositories. The one thing many things I love about Spring Data. One of the things I love about Spring Data is you get this consistent programming model. No matter what database you're working with, what technology you're working with, whether it's JPA, JDBC, you get this nice consistent programming model. And in whether I'm working with Spring Data JDBC or Spring Data JPA, I know that these repositories are out there to help me kind of get off the ground and running. So why are we doing this? We're doing this because we don't want to write all of the methods that interact with the database. I don't want to have to say find all people in the database, or find one person in the database, or save one person in the database, or save all people in the database. I'm going to let Spring Data do the heavy lifting for me. So the way that we do that is there are a bunch of repositories that you can extend from. So there's a CRUD repository. There's also a JPA repository. Coming in Spring Data 3.0 is a list CRUD repository. And I can't use that because I don't have that set up right now, but we did talk about that on office hours, and I do have a video on that, so check that out if you're interested. So we're going to use JPA repository. The JPA repository actually extends paging and sorting and query by example. So we get all of these. Actually, because of that, I don't think I'm going to do that. Let's start here. I'm going to go with the CRUD repository because the CRUD repository just has CRUD stuff like save. Hey, I want to save something. Hey, I want to save all, or hey, I want to find something, or hey, I want to find all. I want to, again, I'm working on two specific kind of pieces of content. One is, let's just talk about Spring Data, JPA, and then paging in Spring Data JPA. Then let's introduce GraphQL. Before we can talk about paging, let's just talk about like how we get stuff in and out of the database with JPA. So I have this CRUD repository, and just by doing this, I can go ahead and inject this repository into any code, and I can go ahead and use it to persist something. So far, so good. Now, to persist something, we're going to have to set, we have to establish a connection to our H2 database. So if you remember from the beginning, we selected H2 as a dependency. We get this dependency in here for H2. This will set up an H2 database, but if we go ahead and just rerun this, oh, yep. So our person repository, we need to come in here. What song am I listening to right now? Um, Sorry, I'm trying to look at my music here. Error creating mean with name person repository defined in enable JPR declared in invocation of a init method failed. So a legal argument exception, not a managed type. Oh, I didn't set something up, did I? Um, yeah, that would help. So when you extend one of those repositories, you have to give it a couple things. So if you look at this, it accepts a type and then the ID of that type. So the type is going to be person and the ID is going to be integer. I mean, I really hope you guys can't hear my music. Can somebody just verify that you guys can't hear my music? You can only hear me. All right. Well, I hope that's the case. Okay. So what I wanted to show you before is this will start up. We see that we have our JPA repositories. It scanned those. Startup Tomcat on 8080. Okay. But we need to set up a data source connect. We haven't said like, hey, here's the name of our database. Let's go ahead and enable the H2 console, things like that. So to do that, we're going into resources and into application.properties. We're going to set up a couple things. So the H2 console, I want to go ahead and enable so we can look at that. There's a generate unique name. I don't want a unique name for the database. I want a name that I can remember. So I'm going to say the data source.name is going to be people. And just for fun, JPA has a show SQL. Let's say true, just so we can see the SQL that's being generated. Okay, so let's go ahead and restart this. All right, so our H2 console is now available at /H2 console. We see that Hibernate drops the table address if it exists. It drops the table person, it drops a sequence, and then it creates two tables here, address and person. So if we were to go back over here and go to localhost 8080, and go to H2 console and visit people, we'll see we have our two tables here, person, there's nothing in it, address, There's nothing in it. And you can see the schema here just by looking at these two. So in person, remember we defined that address underscore ID to reference the ID here in the address table. All right, so far so good. All right. So I want to insert some data. We can do this a few ways. So I want to, we'll just kind of talk about this anyways. So I'm going to create a new package called data. I want to just, actually, we'll start here. So I'm going to create a new Java class. I'm going to call this sample data loader. I'm going to mark this as a component. If I don't, Spring will never know about it. I'd have to like somehow invoke it manually. Because this is marked as component, it will get loaded into the application context and Spring will know about it. What I'm going to do with this is I'm going to implement a interface in Spring called the command line runner. So there is the command line runner, and then there is the application runner. So these two interfaces are both, as you can see, functional interfaces. And basically this is a way that I can go ahead and execute some code after the application context has been created and right before the run, Spring application.run takes place. So right in here, right before this happens, the command line runner is going to take place. It's going to execute whatever code we create. So this is a good place for some type of initialization, bootstrapping. Perfect for this scenario where I just want to, bootstrap some data. You'll also notice that this is marked as a functional interface. There's a single method in here called run, which means that if we didn't want to do this here, you'll see a lot of the times you'll see people who do demos or just some sample code, you'll see it happen here in the main class. The reason people do it in the main class is because the main class is a configuration class. And so a configuration class is a place where we can start to define beans. So if you wanted to define a bean, you could say command line runner, and you could take in some arguments. In our case, if you wanted the person repository, because again, this will happen after the application context is started. So we have access to all of the beans in the application context. So you could say repository, and this is going to return args. And then in here, you could do stuff. So some of that stuff could be initializing data. So you can do that here, but I'm actually going to do that in a separate class. So I'm going to do that in this class, and I need to get an instance of that person repository. Oh. So great comment, Fuel Snable. So I talked about this in a previous video, and I agree with you. When I got started, I thought it was like some special magical thing. So the comment was, I never understood what a bean was. I've been around for a while. Oh, I've been around for a while. I see what you did there. Yeah, so a bean is just a class that Spring is managing, called a Spring bean, right? So when you create your own class, you know that if you were to create a controller, right, and mark it with that REST controller, well, first off, if you create a controller and don't mark it with REST controller, you've created your own class. You have not told Spring about it. So Spring is not going to manage it. It is not going to place it into the application context. And so the application context is just this magical place where all of the classes that you want Spring to manage are stored, right? A bean, whether it's one right here, so sample data loader is going to be a bean. It's going to be stored in the application context as sample data loader, and it's going to reference this thing that we've created. And again, the reason we do this is that we don't want to have to manage these classes ourselves. When it comes to like dependency injection, you don't want to create new instances of classes. You want to have Spring create one instance of the class, and then wherever you need it throughout the application, you just ask for it from Spring. Again, that's where inversion of control comes in. You don't have to manage it yourself. So this is a bean. This is a class that we've marked with one of those annotations like component. When we want to just create a component from a method, that's where we need the @bean annotation, right? Because you can't mark this with @component. It's going to be like, hey, I don't know what you're trying to do there. You can mark it with @bean though, and Spring is now going to manage this for us. So, I always go through the documentation, but it indicates that a method produces a bean. So anytime you see the word bean, just replace it with class. Indicates that a method produces a class that is going to be managed by the Spring container, okay? So that's all we're doing there. Bean, whether it's on a method level or @component on a class, these are all things we're just putting into the application context. I hope that clears some things up. There's nothing magical about them. At the end of the day, they're all classes. Hi, Dan. I just saw you were using Java 17. I'm wondering if you can use the model classes as record classes. So we talked about this. If you're just joining us, you cannot. So we are using Spring Data JPA. And Spring Data JPA, I didn't do that in here. Oh, I didn't generate any of this stuff yet. Well, there's an implicit NOR constructor, right? So let's go ahead and just get this out of the way. I would love to use record classes here, but you can't. So a record class is immutable. When you create a record, so if you do something like right, when we say new developer and we say Dan, Vega, and whatever, Java. Right, when we create a new instance of a developer there, we can, once that instance of developer has been created, we can no longer change the values. We can't change the value of first. It's immutable now. It's not like fully immutable, but it's immutable. And so we have accessors. We can get the information. We can say developer.first or developer.last, but we can never change that information. And because of that, an entity for Hibernate has a no-arg constructor. And because of that no-arg constructor, it's not immutable, right? Like you can just create an instance and then set stuff, even if there's no setters, right? Like that is not what makes it immutable. So no, you can't use records with JPA. You can use them with Spring Data JDBC though. So if you just want to like fall back to JDBC, that's a great project, and you can use records there. When should we use add component instead of add service, and vice versa? Great question. Great question. So the good thing is you could always just use that component if you want. Um, Service, repository, REST controller, these are all just specialized annotations of component. So if you dig into service, you see that that's just a annotation that's marked with that component. If you dig into repository, that's just marked with add component. You know, if it's a service class, mark it with that service. If it's a repository and it's doing data interaction, you know, mark it with that repository. If it's a REST controller, use REST controller. If it's a controller, use controller. There are ways to later on, if you wanted to say, let me find all of the services in my application. Because it's marked with that annotation, that marker, you could do some things with that. Most of the time, you're not doing anything like that, though. So unless it's something specific, like a service or a repository, I'm marking it with add component. Do record classes implement equals hash code toString in a sensible way? Yes. I don't know in a sensible way. I mean, the people who work on the Java team at Oracle are way smarter than me, so I'm gonna assume they are. But yeah, I've had no problems with them. Okay, I'm gonna keep going here. So I have a sample data loader. Because I'm implementing the command line runner interface, I need to implement the one method in there, which is run. We will come back to that in a second. So first, what I need is I need a repository. I need that person repository that we created before over here. I need an instance of that in this class. Now, we were just talking about this, so I do want to kind of cover this. You don't need to mark this with that repository. Because, I mean, you could, it won't hurt. But what happens is Spring will pick this up at runtime and see this marker and basically write a proxy for you, and that'll have the at repository annotation on it. Or I don't even know if it does. Probably it won't need it. So when you mark something, you're saying, hey, Spring, manage this for me. But Spring sees this marker that you're extending the credit repository and will pick it up for you. So you don't need to. It actually doesn't hurt if you add it to it. That's not going to help, though. So I know that Spring is managing an instance of the person repository. So I need an instance of that. So I'm going to say private final person repository, person repository. Do I have any more repositories? No. Let's just call this repository then. And then we're going to add a constructor parameter for dependency injection. So I do have a video on this. If you're not sure like when to use constructor injection or setter injection or field injection, the answer is don't ever do this. There's no reason to. Use constructor injection. We favor that. There are a whole bunch of reasons why. Again, I've done a really good video. Well, in my own opinion, I've done a video on that, so check that out. So now we have an instance of our person repository. And what we could do is we could go ahead and construct a person here. So we could say person is equal to new person. We could say person.set. Let's say first name. Actually, I do have a constructor that takes in first, last. Let's just double check what it is. First, last, phone number, email, and address. First, last, phone number, email, and then address, right? One thing I love to do here is put these arguments on separate lines. So then we need an address. No, I do not want Apache Tomcat JNI. Address 1, city, state. Okay, so that is our person. We've constructed a person. Now we can go ahead and save it. So we're going to use that repository that we got injected into this class for us. We're going to say repository.save. And then again, there are a save and a save all. So if you just have one entity, which we have here, we're going to call save. If you had a collection of them, you can go ahead and call save all. So if you had a list of persons, a list of people, you could use, say, list out of and create a list of them and then just pass that list in, which we will do. So we're going to say save person. So let's go ahead and run this. So we can see down here, because we're logging that, it says insert into address, insert into person, and we have that going on. So if we head back over to the H2 console, there's our person. It's referencing address ID 2. And there's our address. So far so good. Looking good on time. I'm probably going to go for about 2 hours today. So if you want to hang out, hang out. Oh, I'm out of drinks. Don't worry, drinks is just water. Well, not coffee, now water. Anybody been to Hilton Head, South Carolina? Salty Dog, love that place. We go there. So, well, I don't say we don't go there every year. We've been there 2 years. We've been there 2 years in a row now, and we've been there both times. I love it there. Live music, great food, and the store there. We always get gear from the store, so we have shirts and sweatshirts. The whole family has. Okay, so we have our data. We need to take this one step further, though. As I said, this isn't going to really work. We're talking about paging data. This isn't going to work with one particular person. And honestly, I'm not going to sit here and write a bunch of code to construct 100 people or even loop over and, it's a pain in the butt to do. So what I want to do is I want to generate a whole bunch of sample fake data. And there is a really great project for doing this. Let's say Java Faker. And Java Faker so we include this as the dependency. And in your code, you can create an instance of the faker and then just say, hey, give me a fake name, like a first name, a last name, or a full name. There's things like for addresses, and then there's fakers for all of this stuff. So if you want an avatar, if you want a company name, if you want a date and a time, funny name, friends, just all of these things. And some of these, like the address, if you go into address, has more things like the street address, city, etc. So this is a great way to create some fake data. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to grab this, and my music's run out. So I need to put something else on. Okay, so I'm going to copy that. I'm going to head back over here in my pom.xml. I'm going to add that as a dependency, reload our Maven changes. And what I'm going to do is come in here. I'm actually going to create a bean. And what we're going to do with this is we're just going to create an instance of our faker. So public faker should come in faker. And I'm going to go ahead and return new faker. I'm just doing this so that anywhere in my application, I don't need multiple instances of faker. I just need one instance. And I'll probably only use it in this one class, but anytime I start to new up something in a class somewhere, that kind of triggers off an alarm in my head, says I probably should put that in a bean somewhere and let Spring take care of it for me. So now I have an instance of that faker, just like we saw in the example over here. Instead of doing this, I now have an instance that I can use anywhere in my application. And now we'll write code like this to get some fake data. So back in our sample data loader, I'm going to go ahead and remove this. And what I want to do is create I use property-based testing quite much, a bit like Faker, I suppose. Probably, yes. Okay. So what we are going to do is, remember I said there was something in the repository to save all, and that's going to take a collection. Let's create a bunch of people and then just persist them off to the database. I don't want to, if I'm creating 100 or 500 or whatever, I don't want to call save over and over again, right? Like I'm just going to create one call to the database to persist a bunch of information. So I'm going to say I want to get a list of persons. We'll call that people. And we're going to create a stream based on a particular bound. So I want to say int stream dot range closed, and this will allow me to set the start inclusive and end inclusive. So I'm saying from 1 to 100. What are we going to do in each iteration of that stream? What I want to do is I want to call map to object, and this is going to allow me to get access to that particular number. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so I'm going to get that number, and what I'm going to do is for each iteration, I'm going to create a new person. When I'm done, I'm going to collect that. And so I used to do something like that you see there, collectors.toList. You can say collect to list. So this will give us a list. Actually, this is what I used to do. This was confusing. Now there is a toList method. I thought so. So toList allows us to just say, hey, return me a list from this. So no more do you need that collectors toList, etc. So this is what we're doing here. I'm going to put this on a separate line just so I can now, this person, remember the person we created has a constructor for first name, last name, phone number, email, and address. And so for each iteration, we're going to go ahead and create some data. So first we need a first name. So we're going to call, so first we need our faker instance, right? Now we get that injected into this class for us from Spring because we've marked that as a bean and Spring is managing it in the application context. So now we just ask for it in any class we want to use it and we get it. So now what I'm going to do is use that faker instance and say, hey, I know you have this thing called name. From there, I want a first name. Why it's doing that. So we also need a phone number. So there is a phone number. And I'm just going to get a cell phone. So one of the confusing things with this is when I first started using it is you might think like, oh, name. I'll just call it name. Well, name has a whole bunch of methods in it, right? So if you go to name, there's a whole bunch of stuff in here in name. So there's full name, first name, last name, prefix, suffix, all these things. So make sure you're looking at the documentation and just kind of digging through here. Again, phone number returns a phone number, not just a phone number, like a string. So, hey, I want a cell phone. So that's that. Now we need a email address. So there isn't just an email address. There's something called internet that has an email address. And then we need a new address. And then I'm going to do faker dot address dot, what is it, street address? Yeah. So remember in my address component, I have address, city, state, zip. So faker dot address dot city, faker dot address dot state, faker dot address dot zip. That should be it. So far, I'm not getting any errors. It's 100 rows of people in. Okay. So now what we've done is we've created a list of 100 people. So now, as I mentioned before, we can come back to the repository and say save all. And that is going to take in people. So let's go ahead and rerun this and see if this works. Oh, great. No errors. You see a whole bunch of person and address inserts in here. Cool. So let's go back to the browser. Just make sure everything got inserted. And look at all the funny data that got inserted. Great. So now we have some actual data to work with. Things like, real email addresses, names, first name and last name, real phone numbers. We have some addresses in here. And this is great because now if I'm starting to work with things like filtering and paging and sorting, now I can start to test those out. So this is a great way to kind of do that, to get some fake data in there without having to do it yourself. And if you did it yourself, you would have like first name 1, first name 2, first name 3. And that doesn't really help you when you want to try to like filter by or sort by. So this works out good. So again, this is Java Faker. Love this library. Great work. I don't know the author. Shame on me. I don't know if there is a single author. Let's see who's. I don't know. Okay. So check that out. Now we have a bunch of data. Now we can talk about paging. So let's start with this. So let's go with a new package. We're going to call it controller. I'm going to create a person controller. I'm going to mark this as a REST controller. I'm going to create a, actually let's say that this request mapping is for /API/people. Let's create a get mapping. Public. This is going to bring back a list of persons. Find all. Turn null for now. Let's get an instance of our person repository. Inject that using constructor injection, and then we'll say repository.findAll, which is not going to return a list. It's going to return an iterable. Again, Spring Data 3.0, can't wait for that. There's a list CRUD repository, which instead of this method, find all, instead of it returning an iterable, it's going to return a list. We're just much more used to working with lists. So excited about that. I did a video on that. Check out the YouTube channel if you haven't seen that. So this is just a controller, a REST controller that we can go ahead and hit at /API/people. There's a single get mapping. So this at this path, we're going to call this method. This method is going to call the find all method that we didn't have to create. Again, this is done in the CRUD repository for us. So we get that. And it's going to bring back all of the people in our database. So let's go ahead and restart this. Back to the browser, and instead of going to the H2 console, let's go to API/people. Of course, all of our people are in here. But, you know, from a client perspective, we may not always want all of these records to come back, right? And this is where paging comes in. We could say, hey, on initial load, I want the first 10 records. On the client summary, you would hit next, and that next would say, well, the page is now the next page, and I want the next 10 records. So before we talk about how we do that in GraphQL, let's talk about how we do it just in Spring Data JPA. Because again, if you're joining me, we're talking about how we do this in GraphQL, but what I really want to point out here is that GraphQL doesn't care about your data layer. GraphQL is independent of that, just as REST is. You know, REST here, this is a REST controller. This is independent of the things we're doing on the data layer. Yes, we have a method in here that says, go get me all the people, but that is independent of data. It's calling a repository, and we are, you know, we are delegating that responsibility to the repository, and it has nothing to do with the controller. Same will go for GraphQL. But we don't want find all. We want, let's just say, actually, we'll do it in the get mapping. So what I want to do is, back in my repository, if I look at the CRUD repository, there is no way for us to get pages of data here, right? There's just that isn't here in the CRUD repository. This does exist in another repository. And again, the reason they do this is the Spring Data team splits this out because, a lot of times maybe you don't need paging and sorting. The JPA repository has all this in there. Maybe you don't need all of that. But let's look at what the paging and sorting repository does. So paging and sorting repository, again, it's going to take a type, and then it's going to take a type, the type's ID. If we look at paging and sorting, there are only two methods in here. So this isn't going to work for us totally because we are still calling the save all method to persist all of our information to the database. But these two methods are what we care about when it comes to, we do. So these two methods in here, this actually extends CRUD repository. So we get all of that information in the CRUD repository. The JPA extends paging and CRUD. So you could use JPA if you wanted as well. And in fact, let's just go ahead and do that. So again, same thing. You got to give it the type and then the ID type. So the JPA repository extends paging and sorting, which extends CRUD, and then also query by example execute. Okay, so that's kind of what I wanted to get at, was pick the right repository for the job that we're doing. In our case, we're not using that stuff. So let's get away from that. So with paging and sorting, we have these two methods in here. This is the one I want to focus on because this takes a pageable. So now this find all method, when we want to say, hey, go ahead and find all of the people in the database, but I'm going to pass you a request that contains some information about the request, like which page I want, what the size of the request is. So this find all method takes a pageable. So a pageable is an interface. You can go through this interface. There is a page request. And that page request extends abstract page requests, which implements that pageable. So let's come back here. Page request has some nice static methods in here to create an instance of a page request. So you could say, hey, page request .of, you can give it the page and then the size, and it will just kind of ignore sorting for this case. And this is the one I want to look at. So what we want to do is go back to our person controller, and in the find all, I want to take some request params. So we're going to say @request param, and this is going to be an integer called page, and we'll do a request param integer size. So again, the page is what page am I on? So if I want 10 records at a time, the first page is like an array, the index is 0. So on page 0, I'm going to have records 1 through 10. When I move to page 2, I'm going to have records 11 through 20. And so that's what it's asking for. It's saying, hey, give me the page that you want and the number of records per page that you want. Okay? So we're going to create a page request. I just showed you this class over here that ultimately implements that pageable, which is what find all takes. Find all wants a type pageable, and then it's going to return to you a page, which we'll look at in a second. But so the first part of this is let's create a page request, call it a PR, and we could say page request, and then we start to see all of these .of overloaded methods. All I care about is a page and a size right now. I've got the page and I've got the size from the request parameters. So now what I can do is I can call my repository. I can pass in my page request. Did we update this? Yes. So that should be okay. Whoops. Why did I do that? So you can see this takes a pageable. So we're going to pass in our page request. So now we should be able to go ahead and restart this. And now instead of, so API people, well, we could set some default values, which we may. I'm going to just go ahead and pass these in though. So what I want to say is the page is equal to 0 and the size is equal to 2. Just give me 2 records at a time. There they are. So there's the 2 records, but let's talk about what's being returned. I've actually defined something that is not the same. So a page is an interface. A page of type T extends slice T, and slice extends streamable. So this is where we're going to get a lot of the information like the content, whether it was sorted, things, has next, all of that. So if you look at this, we have content. This is the content. So this is what we care about as far as what we're getting back. Then you're going to get things like pageable, total pages. So we know that we have 100 records. We're asking for 2 at a time. That will give us a total of 50 pages in the entire collection. We also have things like total elements, first, size, number, sort, all of these things. And that's why we're returning that information. So I'm going to change this to a page of person. Sorry. So again, same thing here. Let's go ahead and change this to 10. So now I have 10 records in here. You could see that we have a total of 10 pages because we have 100 elements and we're asking for 10 at a time. So all of this information that comes back is information that's going to be helpful to the client. Now, you may not decide to send all of it back, but you would want to send things like, here's the total number of pages, here's what the total number of elements. Is this the last page? So think about if you're displaying the number of pages and then a next and a previous and next. So if last was true, you would disable that next button. First is true, so you would disable the previous button on that first load, right? So these are all things that help kind of the client just make displaying this pageable information possible. So, okay. So that's it from the GPA side of things. Any kind of questions, anything we didn't cover from, I know we could get into like filtering and the sorting. There's not much more to sorting. Again, you could take in something like string sort, and you can pass it. There's another method here. Sorry, this is a sort sort dot by. I want that one. and then you can take in sort. So if I wanted to restart this, and let's say that we wanted to sort by first name, so Hugo will not be first now. If we sort by first name. Now we're getting 10 at a time, but we're sorting by first name. So sorting, pretty easy to do. Filtering, you're just adding new API endpoints depending on how you want to filter. If you just have a couple things you want to filter by, that's fine. If you get really dynamic, that's when things get a little bit crazy, but I don't want to get into that today. We can at another time. So any questions on that? Okay. So let's move on to GraphQL. Again, I wanted to do this first because I want to keep reiterating this over and over because I get questions a lot on like, how do I do query by this or page by this or filter by, like in GraphQL? And it's important to note that GraphQL does not care about your data layer. GraphQL is independent of your data layer. We have our data layer. That's independent of our REST API, right? We create an endpoint that calls our data layer. So we're going to do the same thing in GraphQL. So again, just coming back to it, if you're going to use GraphQL in Spring, until next week when Spring Boot 2.7 is released, you need to be on a 2.7.0 RC and less than 3. And then Spring for GraphQL 1.0 is going to be released next week. So when you include GraphQL, you get this Spring Boot starter GraphQL, and you also get some testing for GraphQL. So with those in place, the first thing we're really going to do is we're going to set up a new directory. So we're going to call this GraphQL, and we're going to create a new file in here called schema.graphqls, and this is by convention. So with everything in, well, I'm not going to say everything, with most things in Spring Boot, you can go ahead and customize everything. So if I come in here and I say GraphQL, I'm actually going to enable this because we'll look at that in a second. And if you wanted to define where you're going to look for these schemas, this schema.locations, right now it's looking in class path in GraphQL/wildcard. So anything in GraphQL folder that matches the extension GraphQLS or GraphQL, I think. But we're not going to change that. I'm going to leave that as is. We have now, again, you could create separate files for every type you're going to create here. But I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to create everything in one schema. So what we're going to do is we're going to create this schema. We're going to say person. And again, we're lining up our types here in GraphQL to our models over here. So I'm going to say that the ID is of type ID. First name is of type string. Last name is of type string. Phone number type string, email is of type string, address is of type address, which we don't have defined yet. There's our first type. Again, we're not going to get too much into a GraphQL 101 here. I have that coming next week, so be on the lookout for that. But just an overall overview of what we're doing here is we're creating the schema in GraphQL. And the schema is how we're going to query against our GraphQL API. GraphQL is built on a very simplistic type system. There's not a lot going on here. We are creating an object type of named person here, and we have some fields in here. And those fields have types. There are just a handful of Scholar types built into GraphQL. ID is 1. As you hover over it, it says the ID scholar type represents a unique identifier. The exclamation point there is just saying, hey, this is never going to be null. When you get this person object back, you don't need to check for null. That ID is always going to be there. And then we have strings, and then we have an object type here. And this is saying, hey, I don't know what that address is, but that's because we haven't created it yet. So again, we're going to have an ID. So we're going to have address, city, state, zip. All right. So now we have our types. We're going to go ahead and create a query. So when it comes to top level operation types in GraphQL, we have 3. We have a query, we have a mutation, and we have a subscription. So a query is going to be anything that we're using for retrieving data. So we'll write all of our kind of retrieval methods here in a query. Mutations are for mutating data. So that is adding, that is updating, that is deleting. And then a subscription is really for like polling. So if you constantly find yourself having to do something on an interview, that's what on interval, that's what a subscription is for. So say you had a stock ticker and you want to constantly check to see what the updated price is, you can do that. Or for something like a chat, that's what kind of polling is for. But so we're going to start with a query. We're going to say type query, and I want to write. Let's write a few. Let's do our first query is going to be called all people. And the name of it is on the left. What is going to be returned from the GraphQL API is on the right. So we're going to return a person, and the square brackets around it simply says that this is going to be a collection of persons. So let's start there. So here in my controller layer, I am going to create a new Java class. We're going to call this the person GraphQL controller. And what we're going to do in here is we're going to mark this as a controller. And this is not a REST controller. We're just marking with add controller 1. It's marked with that component, so Spring will pick it up for us. But also, this is how we will find your GraphQL controllers. It's by looking for the add controller annotation. So it has nothing to do with this name. It has everything to do with if you're marking this as like a GraphQL controller that's going to have mappings in there, just mark it with add controller. Just like the REST API, we need an instance to our repository. So I'm going to say private final person repository. We'll just call this repository. So we'll get an instance through constructor injection. And the first thing I want to do is I want to get all of the people in the database. And I want to make that accessible through the GraphQL API. So how can we do that? So normally we create a method. Remember, that's going to return an iterable of persons. Find all. I can say return repository.find all. That's all there is to it. That method will return all the people. But now what we need to do from a GraphQL standpoint is we've defined that query here in our schema. We need to somehow say to the GraphQL API, when you get a request, well, this is really the engine, right? So we write a query, we send it to the server. So there's a client and a server in this request. When we send this to the server, if you get a request for a query called all people, I want you to map that to this method that we wrote over here. So there's a couple of different ways that we can do this. First, we can use the schema mapping annotation. And this is going to take a couple of things. You can see it says field value and type name. So the first is type name. The type of the operation that we are working on is a query. If this was adding data or updating data or deleting data, this would be a mutation. It's not, it's just a query. The value is, you've told me it's a query. In your schema, what did you name this query? Well, I named it all people. So we're going to put that in there. Now we could do this, but there's actually a shorter version. The same way that in a REST controller, we have things like request mapping, but then we have specialized versions of request mapping. So we have a get mapping, a post mapping, put, delete, etc. So that you don't have to write out, hey, this is a request mapping, and here's the type, here's the method that you're going to use. Just like that, there are specialized versions of the schema mapping. One is called query mapping. All query mapping is going to do is use at schema mapping and use the type name of query, which we've done up here. And then the value that it's going to use is the name of the method. So right now this won't work because we don't have a schema in here called find all. We do have a method called all people. So if we rename this, now this is all we need for this annotation is this at query name. Because it's going to have a type name of query, and then it derives the value from the method name, which is all people. So just with this annotation and this convention, we have successfully told GraphQL, we get a request for all people. I want you to map that to this particular method. And whatever this does, this is what we're going to return. So we're going to return all the records in the database. So let's go ahead and restart this, see if we've done everything okay. Seems like we have. So again, in application.properties, I enabled graphical. So when working with GraphQL, one of the things that I've really found to love about it was just how developer friendly it is. And working with REST APIs and working with teams of REST APIs, they often get methods added to it. They're not documented well. Our GraphQL API is documented right out of the box. And we get this nice playground where we can kind of test some GraphQL queries out. Because again, there are two parts to GraphQL. The client, which is writing the query to request what we want, and the server, which is the execution engine, which is going to take that query and execute it and make all of this magic happen. And the way that happens in Spring for GraphQL, again, go read the documentation. It's great, but Spring for GraphQL is built on GraphQL Java. Really great project that's been around since GraphQL was open source. But GraphQL Java it does a couple things really well. One of those is it's the execution engine. It has no transports. So it doesn't know how to do this over, say, HTTP. And so now Spring builds on top of that and allows you to have like HTTP transports via Spring MVC or Spring Web Flux. It allows RSocket and WebSocket. So all these different transports. So let's head back to the browser. And now what I want to do is just go to graphical. And this is something else. So when you first land on this, you'll get a bunch of information that kind of helps you write GraphQL queries. If you're new to GraphQL, they're a little bit different at first. Looks like JSON, not really SQL. The GraphQL queries are what's known as a DSL, a domain-specific language. Once you get used to them, they're fairly simple, though. It's very intuitive. Again, what GraphQL shines is that we are the client. we get to ask for exactly what we need and nothing more. And this is important because as we start to have all these different systems, a mobile device, a toaster, a refrigerator, a web app, a service in another service somewhere, contacting our APIs, they all have different needs and they all have different constraints. So on a web-based platform, you have, I have this large screen in front of me. I have all this real estate. I can ask for a whole bunch of data and fit it all on the screen. I don't have to worry about things like batteries or internet here on my web application. Those things change when you go to a mobile app, right? Like you have less real estate, battery, performance, real estate. These things are challenges that we work with. So we have to, we may not, the same API that works for our web app may not work for our mobile app. So that is the power of GraphQL, where we get to sit here and say, this is exactly what I want and nothing more. So let's get rid of all this. Again, I said before, we get some introspection here. We get some automatic documentation for us. I said before, we have these root types: query, mutation, subscription. We have one query here. We have one field called all people, which will return a collection of persons. So the way that this works over here is we're going to start with query. We're going to say that we're going to call all, and as I start typing all, you see I get some introspection there. I'm going to call all people, and from all people, I want an ID, I want a first name, and I want a last name. We'll get into the other stuff in a minute, but this is all I want. So now I'm going to go ahead and execute this, and boom, right away, you see that I get all of these records back. Okay? So this is where we were. This is where most people probably get to. What we want to do now is create another schema or another query, right? I want to create something where I can say all people paged. Again, this is just going to return a collection of people. But we can take some arguments here. I want to take a page, which is going to be an integer, and I could take a size, which is going to be an integer. And you can see this is similar to the REST API, right? Like we just had some request parameters for page and size. We're doing the same thing here in our schema. We're saying, hey, this all people paged query is going to take two parameters, two arguments in the GraphQL world. And those arguments are going to help us define what we get back. So now that we have that, we need to hook this up to a method in our person GraphQL control. So I'm going to create another query mapping. And within this query mapping, we're going to do, we're going to say, hey, we're going to return a public. Now remember, back in my person controller, it's pretty much this. In fact, let's do this. Let's copy this and see what we need to change, right? So you're not going to get a request param in GraphQL. It's not coming through a request. Everything is a post through a single endpoint. What we will get is something called an argument, and that is from the GraphQL data method annotation. That is that one. So let's say argument. Oh, I copied the wrong one. It's this. Right. So now we are doing the same thing. Now we don't have this mapped up, right? We need to make sure this name matches this name because we're using query mapping and it's going to look at the name and derive that for the value. But now as an argument, we're getting a page and a size, and we're doing the same thing we were doing in the API controller. We're creating a page request because the find all method takes a pageable argument. And page request implements is a class that implements something that implements pageable, right? So this will work. So this gets into, again, GraphQL doesn't care about your data layer. We're just creating a method in here to map to our GraphQL schema. The data layer stays the same. All we're doing is taking in some arguments. So let's restart this and see how we can write a query to do this. Okay, so there's that. Okay, so what I want now is a query. We're going to call all, I got to refresh this. All people, and now you see it's giving me some help here saying this is what that is. All people paged. Now, all people paged takes a couple of arguments. I'm going to say page 0, size. And again, we've defined these types, right, in the schema. So I can't come in here and say 10. Like we'll get an error if we do that. But I want to say 10. Actually, let's just say like 3 so I can see them on screen. That defines the constraints of that I'm going to pass to the server, the Spring Boot app, which is the execution engine. Now as a client, I got to say, I still got to define what I want back. Maybe I just want the same things back, but let's do this. Let's do ID, first name, last name, phone number, email. And now when I do address, I can't just get the whole address back, right? We look at this, I get a person back. Address is an address that has fields in it. Maybe you want everything, maybe you don't. That's one of the things of GraphQL though, is you need to be very explicit with what you want. So I want the address, city, state, and I should just get 3 people back, and I've got a lot more information. Let's just get 2. And there you have it. So we're getting exactly what we asked for back. And now on the client side, you can see that this is Robert and Colin. If I move to page 1, I'm now looking at 2 different records. If I move to page 2, I'm now moving to those records. So that's really where paging starts. Where am I at time? Okay, I'm probably gonna have to start wrapping up here soon. We're coming up on 2 hours. So that's where paging starts. Now again, what we are returning is just the data, right? So we have all people paged. Let me show you. So what you need now is on top of the people that you're going to return in that collection, you're going to have to return something higher than that, which is like, hey, this is a person paged collection, right? So that you know how many total rows are in it. Is it the first? Is it the last? Etc. I want to show you an example of this. See if I can. What I'm doing is I'm actually just starting up my website locally. So locally, my website is built on GraphQL, and I have this nice Explore playground, just like I do in Spring Boot. Again, most time you run into, oh, you know what? This is on 80, 81. It still might work. So we get this nice, it looks a little different. This is GraphQL Playground instead of Graphical. But again, we can start to write some queries in here. So on my website, all of these collections are things that are in the GraphQL API, like all my blog posts, all courses, newsletters, everything that I have is kind of in a GraphQL API. So what I can do is I can say, hey, give me all posts. So just like we did before, I can say query all posts. And inside of all posts, you'll see what comes back first is total count, page info, and then edges. So total count I would like to have, page info I would like to have, and then edges I would like to have. So what is actually let's back up on edges, right? Let's just run this. Page info must have a selection. Okay, so we'll get some. Oh, why did I ask that? So inside of page info, that's an object type. So page info then says, hey, how many per page? What is the current page? How many total pages? How many total items? What is has previous page? Has next page? Is first? Is last? So let's run that. So when I get all of the posts, I can see that I have 137. The page info is saying, hey, the current page that you're on is the first page. The total number of pages is 1. The total items is 137. So when I call all posts, I'm getting everything. There's no pagination going on right now. But all of this info here is what you would need to start paging, right? So the edges now is the collection of each of the posts. So we have something called a post edge here. And in the post edge, we have like next and previous. So you can jump to the next post or the previous post. So let's just say, let's just come down here. Whoops, sorry. Down here and say post, what is it? Page info, edges. And inside of edges, I have a node. And inside of node, I have things like title. Am I outside of? Oh, that's why. So edges. And then inside of edges, I have a node. And then inside of node, I have things like the title of the post. So let's just get all of those. You can see here all my blog posts. Spring Bout add value annotation. I'm joining VMware. Happy New Year 22. And then you could just get more information out of here. So again, this is the node. So let's just get like the slug. Let's get the date. And let's get the tags. So the tags have things like, actually I don't want tags, do I? Yeah. What is in a tag? A tag has a title, so that's all I care about. Now if I run this, I get things like the title, the slug, the date, tags. Yeah, so cool. So I guess what I'm saying with this is what we've done here is we are simply returning the page and the number of people per page. What we want to do is extend this now. We want to have an API that looks like this. So all post is not just going to return a collection of, or all, let's go back to it. All people paged is not just going to return a collection of persons, right? We're actually going to return some other type that contains the total count. Maybe our page info. It's going to have something called edges, which is now going to be which is going to have something in it called a node, which is of type person in our case. So we have the beginnings of a paging system here. We can go ahead and start to work on that and extend on it. I think what they've done here, I'm using Gridsome for my static site generation. It's a view-based framework, but I don't know what they're using underneath the hood. I can't imagine they rolled GraphQL on their own, or why. I'm not sure why they would. So this seems like a pretty good way to go. So what I will do is, well, first of all, any questions? If we have any questions, let me know. I'm going to keep talking while I say that, but what I'm going to do is get this code online. I'll go ahead and post this code, and I'll get it out there. If you don't already follow me on Twitter or YouTube, head over to danvega.dev. Links for all my socials are down here. Follow me on Twitter, and I will post this code. And what I'll do is then start to work on this and progress on this so that we can turn this into not only just a collection of the correct persons, but all of the info you might want as a consumer of the GraphQL API to be able to do paging, right, on the client side. I think that's it for today. 2 hours of fun. Yep. We're almost coming up on time here. I think that's where I'm going to call it. I'm sticking around here for a couple minutes. If you have questions, please go ahead and ask them. Let me know if you enjoyed this. We can do this again soon. Let me know what topics you want to see, whether it's here on code or on my YouTube channel or in a blog post. Let me know what you're interested in hearing about or seeing me demo. I kind of like this. I had my music on, so I hope you didn't hear it. I was able to kind of just write out some things and talk about them as we went. So this is a lot of fun. I usually do this once a month, but our code episodes are every week. So each time a new member of the advocacy team will jump on here and do the same thing I did. So if you haven't been here before, check it out. Again, this is on the Tanzu Developer Center over at Tanzu TV. The show we're talking about today is code, which is going to do some weird things here. I also am on another show called Office Hours with my good buddy Deshaun. And again, we talk about what's new in the Spring world. We show off some demos. I'll probably extend this on to Office Hours next week and answer your questions. So if you've ever felt like you needed a place to ask your questions and there's no one to answer them, this is a great place. If it's a very technical, like how to do this thing in AWS, I don't know that we'll be able to answer that. But if you want to have a discussion about what you're working on and what problems you're facing, that's a good forum for that. So cool. Happy Wednesday. I hope everybody's week is going well. We're over the hump, almost there. A couple more days to the weekend. I hope you all have something exciting planned for the weekend. I, for one, have finally got a weekend where it's just like relax. I got a few weeks until I hit the road again, and we're going to Toronto for Spring One tour, and then I leave Toronto and go down to Fort Lauderdale for Vue.js or VueConf US. Really excited about both of those conferences. So, all right, no questions. Thanks everyone for joining me. I appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. As always, friends, happy coding.